Hey nerds, what's up? Is the young adult classification getting older? That's the question I asked myself recently when I was trying to find books for my advanced reader at the library. As an 11-year-old, his interests mostly firmly lie in that middle grade section. However, his teachers want him to read longer, more difficult books because he is ready for that. However, about 75% of the stuff he picks out in the YA section of our library ends up being too adult or inappropriate upon closer look. And it felt like more of the books in the YA section are really meant for older teens than the younger end of that group. Now, I was trying to decide if this was just a me thing, a new perception I had because I now have parent eyes, because after all, isn't every generation complaining that the next generation is like doing things too young or like becoming more adults? Well, after a deep dive, it turns out that there is some evidence that YA is actually skewing older. In 2025, Ali Watkins published her findings in the New Review of Children's Literature and Librarianship Journal under the title, "Is Popular Young Adult Literature Aging Up?" In it, she calculated the age of all the protagonists in young adult New York Times bestsellers over the last 10 years. She found that protagonists are more likely to be 17 years or older, with novels moving away from focusing on children under 15. The researcher did mention that 10 years may not have been long enough to look at to really see a shift. In the last 10 years, all the YA was skewing older. And while this study is obviously not perfect since it is only looking at a small selection of books on the bestsellers, I do think the results are interesting. Compounding that is another interesting statistic. In a study done jointly by HarperCollins and Nielsen Books in 2024, 74% of YA readers were over 18, with 28% of the readers over the age of 28. Now, while the age group that they show between 18 and 22 is still in a range where I think it would be normal to perhaps be transitioning away from YA but still reading YA, almost half of readers of young adult at 46% were over 23, generally an age we consider firmly adult. So it's not just that YA is skewing older in subject matter, but it is also that the readers of YA are also skewing older, and in some cases, much older than its purported range of 12 to 17 years old. Now, this is a little bit the chicken and the egg, because is YA skewing older and then it's attracting more older readers, or is YA skewing older because older readers were buying it and thus the publishers were meeting the demand? Now, there are many ideas put forward about why this trend might be happening. You have the idea of delayed adulthood, lack of literacy, or just trends in literature, among others. There's also been a lot of criticism and concern leveled over the quality of this new YA and the people who read it. So today, let's talk about this change in YA and what it might mean, and if it even matters, by exploring the history of the YA classification, what quality means when we talk about young adult fiction, and how this might all play into what we consider the literary crisis. We'll talk about that after the jump. In terms of the creation of young adult fiction, there's conflicting reports on when the terminology of young adult first appeared in relation to a book category. According to Merriam-Webster, the first known usage of the term in that way was in 1942, whereas other sources claim it was used in news articles as early as the 1930s. But regardless of when the term was actually first used or created, it seems that the concept of the young adult novel was really solidified in the 1960s and regularly became a part of people's conversation. It was also in that decade where two really important pieces of young adult fiction were published, the first being A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle and The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, both now considered classics that are still regularly studied in schools today. Young adult was created quite simply because educators saw that there needed to be some sort of bridge between the children's books being studied in elementary school and the rigorous classics that were being studied in high school. The original categorization was really aimed at kids between the ages of 12 and 17 years old. Articles at the time pointed out how it was better for kids to read something less worthy and enjoy it than read a classic or a more worthy book and absolutely hate it. But at the time, criticism came out that we were dumbing down literature and that kids would suffer because of it. Sound familiar? Honestly, I find it kind of comforting that our discourse over young adult literature really hasn't changed much in like 60 odd years. I read a bunch of journal articles published about the YA categorization over the different decades, and it was interesting to see how many of them just sounded the same and brought up the same things. There are two articles in particular I'd like to focus on, the first being Criticism in the Young Adult Novel by Stephen Dunning, published in the High School Journal in 1962. He starts the article by introducing the junior novel as a transition period between childhood fiction and adult classics, and talks a lot about people who are trying to kill the genre. Now, he used that word, not me. I know we generally don't view YA as a genre today, but more of an age classification, but that's how they were talking about it. He talked about how people would often use the very worst of YA as an example of a reason to stop doing it, whereas people who loved it would use the very best examples, and how there was, a middle ground here. He said, as Mr. Summers put it, the time has come at last, if it is not long overdue, for the serious literary consideration of that singular stepchild of American letters, the junior novel. Junior novels, like their betters, should be judged by the same high standards of criticism which should govern the acceptance or rejection of any literary work. Miss Emery puts it equally succinctly. The remedy is not to kill the genre, but to find more competent criticism for it, quicker recognition and stronger support for the books that do present true values in good literature, and sounder evaluation of characterization and style. He then goes on to list certain specifications that he thinks offer better criticism on how to judge young adult literature. Now, I won't belabor the point by reading it out loud, and I'll just show it on screen, but many of these specifications may feel a bit overkill or heady. It's important to remember the context of this journal article, however. This was not aimed at parents looking for books for their children to enjoy, but rather teachers and librarians when searching for books to build curriculums around. I find this article, although it was written 60 plus years ago, to really mirror conversations we're having today, although I'll admit that I think today no one is arguing that we should kill YA as a whole. I think in general we accept that young adult literature is a very important classification, that's very useful, but I think conversations on the quality and what children are getting out of it are alive and well as ever today. In fact, if we jump forward several decades, we can take excerpts from the article The Problem with YA Literature by Chris Crow, published in the English Journal in 2001. Attacks on YA books are nothing new. For more than a century, there have been vocal parents, teachers, and librarians who've attacked books written specifically for teenagers. Their complaints have varied over the years, but most objections generally fall into one of two categories. YA books are bad because 1, they aren't the classics, and 2, they corrupt the young. It is no surprise that the range of quality is as broad in YA literature as it is in adult literature. We have a handful of classics, followed by a good bunch of brilliant novels, followed by an impressive collection of readable and entertaining books, but we also have some YA novels marred by weak writing and/or bound in repulsive juvenile covers. Unfortunately, the clunkers are the books that critics of YA literature seem to be most familiar with. If someone's looking for lousy books to use to condemn the entire field, it's easy to browse the shelves in a discount store and find an armful of poorly conceived, badly written, mindless books labeled YA. Another problem, for some people at least, is that YA books haven't been around long enough to be canonized. In a recent syndicated column, Kathleen Parker's attack on YA literature paralleled the concerns of many adults. She's upset about the latest fad of shelving literary classics in favor of contemporary, more fun-to-read books, which is now being advanced by the nation's oops educationalists. She adds, "We do children no favor by continually lowering the bar to accommodate their appetite for entertainment." Parker probably didn't really mean to suggest that literary classics aren't entertaining, but her argument relies on the traditional views that if something is entertaining, it certainly can't be worthwhile, and that hard work in the case of reading the classics, though inherently unpleasant, is ultimately good for you. This article also includes a quote that I want to include here from the late British author and book critic Anthony Holden, in which he says, "We are a country with dramatically declining standards of literacy, increasingly dragged down to the lowest common denominator by their purveyors of all forms of mindless mass entertainment. The success of the Potter books is just another dispiriting proof of the Murdoch-led dumbing down of all our lives. These are some of the reasons why I said, during and after the white bread judging, that a victory for Harry Potter would have sent out a signal to the world, like the monarchy and the dome, that Britain is a country that refuses to take itself seriously. I did not, as reported, further argue that children's books cannot be great literature. Of course they can, if they are well written, stretch the reader's imagination, and open virgin minds to the magical power of words." Ouch. I just want to say, the conversations have never changed. In the 60s, people were really worried that we were no longer reading Moby Dick, that the classics. In the 2000s, people were worried that the kids liked Harry Potter too much, and they weren't going beyond that. And now I feel like we talk a lot about how romance is really popular, especially in the YA genre, and how that's ruining literature forever. To be clear, I'm not arguing or trying to imply that these conversations are wrong or that we shouldn't be thinking about and worrying about quality in our children's fiction. In fact, we're about to talk about it today in this video. I just do, however, think it's almost comforting to see these kind of discussions have literally been happening since the inception of literature, and that a lot of the times the things we worry about don't always come to pass in the ways we expect. However, we obviously should be worrying about quality, especially when it comes to literacy. But what does quality even mean? Quality is always a tough thing to talk about because the definition of quality is a nebulous thing, and one I have tried to talk about a lot in other videos. Many balk at the idea of something that's popular automatically makes it quality, that popularity doesn't inherently mean quality. But on the other hand, I often find it silly when people immediately dismiss things that are popular and say things that are popular could never be quality. Either way, today we won't be diving into that specific argument on quality, and instead I want to talk about a different aspect of quality in YA fiction that I tend to think falls into 3 separate categories. The first is a phenomenon that I have definitely been guilty of myself, and this is a category of quality YA that adults are in love with. These are, whether it be a book, a TV show, a movie, are things made for children and young adults that get a ton of awards and a ton of praise, but it seems that children don't actually like them. It's like this specific brand of young adult and children's fiction that is written to be enjoyed by adults, but isn't necessarily enjoyed by the people who are actually supposed to enjoy the story. They may feel like quality to the adults, but if they aren't actually enjoyable to kids, are they quality? The second category of quality is the exact opposite of that. It is things that are made for children and young adults that are wildly popular among children, but adults don't like them, whether they find them too loud or juvenile or just not highbrow enough. Children enjoy these things, but adults don't. And then, of course, that means there is the third category of quality that is generally considered the gold standard, which is media that is created for children or young adults that adults also love and the children consuming it are obsessed with as well. This middle blend of media that everyone enjoys that's made for children tends to be the things that get the most praise and the most popularity because they are enjoyed by all ages, even if their intended target audience is youth. The reason I bring this up is I think that quality can really differ based on what we perceive the goals of YA to be. The purpose stated for young adult fiction is to give children aged 12 through 17 stories that reflect them, reflect their lives and the problems they are going through, get them to love reading, act as a stepping stone to help develop greater literacy and understanding of more difficult texts in the future. Our limited view of classics and back when things were good, I think often ignore these first 2 important aspects of young adult fiction, which is that young adult fiction is supposed to reflect children's experiences and speak to them. In that way, quality YA can have multiple meanings. Some quality YA will, yes, increase their vocabulary, will increase their critical thinking skills in terms of literature, and will advance their reading capabilities. But other YA may succeed by being relatable and emotionally resonant with its intended audience. And yes, it's possible that things that are emotionally resonant with teens may not be emotionally resonant with adults. In fact, I was just thinking recently about some of my favorite things, particularly books and music I listened to as a teen, feel a little to a lot over dramatic and even sometimes a little cringe. But isn't that part of the teen experience, being a little over dramatic and sometimes, yes, a little cringe? So where does this leave us in the quality debate? Obviously, there is some sort of quality. We can make judgment about things. There tends to be kind of 2 sides in this I see often in education circles, which is the first one, which is let kids read whatever they want. Quality doesn't matter. The purpose is to get kids to love to read, and that is the only goal. The other side of this coin is, hey, quality does matter. And if we want kids to get better, they can't just read whatever they want. It's not good enough. They have to read things that meet specific goals to increase their literacy. This conversation is, quite frankly, where I see a potential issue with the adult-ification of young adults. It is not that these books shouldn't exist. I think books should exist of all levels and all experiences so that they can speak to the people who need them most. And it's not even bad that adults are reading them, although we can talk about perhaps the effect on literacy about that later. What may be concerning is that it is erasing a very important demographic of book that speaks to these teens' experiences and helps them feel seen through the literature they read. This really important demographic of younger teens in which they may feel too old for the babyish storylines of the shrinking middle grade category, but too young to really relate to or understand the experiences of the teens depicted in this much older YA. And yes, things being true and understandable to experiences is actually important to literacy. So let's talk about literacy for a second. It is commonly reported that US literacy rates are in decline. I'll be using data from the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, or PIAAC, for this discussion. PIAAC defines literacy as the ability to understand, evaluate, use, and engage with written text to participate in society, to achieve one's goals, and to develop one's knowledge and potential. This is really important to understand because too often people think literacy just actually equals being able to read the specific word on the page. A lot of people think when we say the term illiterate, it means that someone literally can't decode or read the words on a page. That is actually not true. Part of literacy is comprehension, understanding the written word. Now, this was something actually I didn't really understand about literacy until several years ago when I was teaching my own children to read. And then it came up a lot. It was crazy to see how I could watch my kid sound out and read words, but then have no ability to understand or tell me the meaning of the words they just read. That is called decoding. Being able to decode words is being able to literally read the words on the page. But comprehension, understanding, and being able to use the information you read is a vital component of literacy. PIAAC uses 5 levels of literacy, with levels 3 through 5 generally being considered literate. I won't read all of the levels, but I do want to give you an idea of what these levels look like by reading the below level 1 definition. Most adults at below level 1 are able to process meaning at the sentence level. Given a series of sentences that increases in complexity, they can tell if a sentence does or does not make sense either in terms of plausibility in the real world or in terms of the internal logic of the sentence. Most adults at this level are also able to read short, simple paragraphs and, at certain points in the text, tell which word among two makes the sentence meaningful and consistent with the rest of the passage. Finally, they can access single words or numbers in very short texts in order to answer simple and explicit questions. The text at below level 1 are very short and include no or just a few familiar structuring devices such as titles or paragraph headers. They do not include any distracting information. If you notice, even at the lowest level of literacy, people have the ability to decode words. What they don't have is a lot of ability to use or comprehend the words they are reading in a meaningful way for their lives. Now, I'm not going to read any of the other levels, but I will throw them up on the screen here if you're interested, and you can pause and read what the cutoffs for every other level of literacy are. In 2024, 57% of the US adults aged 16 to 65 were considered illiterate, scoring a level 2 or below. This study did report low response rates, and that should be taken into consideration when viewing this data, although effort was made to account for that discrepancy, and you can read more about their methodology on their website. But yeah, clearly we need to do something about that. 57% is a giant number. We should be worried about that. And it obviously probably has a little bit to do with schools and education. So that means the US, that needs to happen at like the state level and the national level. It probably needs to concern parents and caregivers at home with their own kids. Yeah, I'm not really equipped to tell people how to fix this. But yes, it's a concerning statistic. What I do know, though, is that books that interest teens and get them to want to read are important. And I think we've established that. I don't think anyone here is going to argue with that. But I want to talk about how we've established that understanding and comprehension is a vital component of literacy. This matters because I do have this pet peeve that I think people often oversimplify what it means for adult literature. Often when people say something is adult, they just mean that it has sex, language, violence, and adult characters. And the only thing making something young adult is just an absence of those things. I've always taken an issue with this. Yes, obviously, graphic sex and language and violence we'll make a book adult because we often don't want children reading that stuff. But I think there are so many other things that should make something adult. Actually, it reminded me of this video from Community Channel, which is the first YouTube channel I ever subscribed to back in the early 2000s.
I'd love to know today as an adult, what is an adult theme? Because when you're a kid, it sounds so exciting. You think you're gonna see sex or violence or something, but then you realize it can just mean something emotional. Knock yourself out. Where are all my receipts that are business related? This is terrible. That's my neck. My back is in so much pain these days. But my chiro taught me some exercises for my back. If you just stretch, I think what I might do is I might paint this blue and have a feature wall in another room. Did you want to talk renovations with us?
Books that are labeled as adult ideally also have these other things. They have more complex thoughts, ideas, and character interactions. They might have ideas and situations that require lived experiences that often happen as you age, may require you to understand unreliable narration without being explicitly told, may have themes and complex ideas that you are expected to pick up on without being explicitly told, and have more characters, locations, and plot points to keep track of. There have been many times where I will read an adult book that is obviously labeled adult because of like graphic sex scenes or a lot of language, but the thematic elements and plot complexity feel way more at home in young adults. Similarly, I've seen a lot of people try to shove books into YA if they are just simply missing sex and language and violence, and yet they don't really belong there because they contain lived experiences that clearly are more geared to adults. To bring forth a really silly example of this that I think I can say because most people will understand what I'm talking about, and it's a book I'm allowed to spoil, I'll talk about reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire with my child. At the time, he was about 8 or 9, and I had to explain to him why it would be embarrassing for Ron and Harry to invite girls to the Yule Ball and how being rejected would be embarrassing. At the time, he obviously had no dating experience, and he was also a kid who was completely uninterested in romance in any way. And he did not understand the social implications of the Yule Ball. Was Harry Potter inappropriate for him? No. It was a book that's verging in the middle of middle grade and YA. But were there lived experiences that he didn't have to fully comprehend a portion of the story? Yes. This is a silly example, I understand, because like, who cares? But I hope it kind of illustrates the point about how giving kids clean adult books isn't always benefiting them. There's no harm in it. It's not like a big deal if they read something they don't understand. I think it's a natural experience of a bookworm to pick up a book that just is like way over your head. But when we're talking specifically about books that kids and teens can enjoy and comprehend, giving them books that talk about and express experiences they understand and comprehend is actually an important component. There have been times when someone will suggest that I give my son an adult book that I love, like one of my favorites, because it's squeaky clean, so he might as well be able to read it. And I've responded, yeah, he could read it, but he wouldn't get it. He wouldn't understand it, and it wouldn't be very enjoyable because he wouldn't get the same thing out of it. Just because there's no harm done doesn't also represent the fact that there is a reason kids maybe want to read things thematically appropriate to them so they can fully understand and grow from that novel. So my worry here with the adultification of young adult fiction is that we are losing this important category of text in this regard. It's not about a moral panic, about being specifically worried about content in that way. It's being worried that there isn't appropriately aged situations and books that are enjoyable and comprehensible to teens at that level. I think sometimes we just get bogged down in quality talks in the wrong thing, and we miss this important kind of relatability aspect to quality in young adult fiction. So what about the adults reading YA, the other piece of the puzzle to the adultification of young adult fiction? I feel like a lot of articles or blog posts about this perpetuate a lot of judgment about those kind of adults, and so I'm hoping that I will avoid that here. If you've been on my channel a while, you might be going, but Bookborn, you always say you don't read young adult anymore, and that you cover like 99% adult fantasy because you don't want to read young adult. That's not because I think young adult doesn't have good quality fiction. It's because I've just found that at this point in my life, adult fiction speaks to me and my experiences and the things I'm interested in a lot more. I don't think that's a negative. I think that's a natural progression of where I am in my life, that obviously adult stories about adult characters are going to just speak to me a little bit more. I might read a YA every once in a while if it's gained a lot of popularity, if I'm particularly interested in it, but in general, I'm seeking out stories that reflect my period of life. And I say that even as someone who came into adult fiction somewhat late. I actually didn't really make the transition to adult fantasy until I was 21 years old. Previously, anytime I'd kind of tried to dip my toe in adult fantasy, I was met with a lot of graphic content that I did not personally enjoy reading, so I often retreated to the safety of young adult fiction. And I've actually had a lot of women in my life tell me that the same thing happened to them. I ended up reading The Wheel of Time when I was 21, and that was like it for me after that. I loved that so much. I felt like I had been missing so much, and I pretty much completely switched over to adult fiction from there. The majority of young adult fantasy is written by women. Now, actually, several years ago, I think about 5 years ago, I actually ran the numbers on like the top 100 best-selling YA books in the last 20 years and adult fantasy books in the last 20 years, and the numbers showed that like a vast percentage of the YA was written by women, even more so than the gender discrepancy in adults. I could not find this spreadsheet anywhere, so I can't give you the specific numbers, but it is well established that in general, YA fantasy is predominantly written by women, while adult fantasy is predominantly written by men, although I do feel like that has shifted a lot in the last decade. I also noticed today that even though I don't have stats for it, a majority of these young adult readers who are greater than 23 years in age tend to be women. This seems to be an established fact, even though I couldn't find, I want to be clear, I couldn't find a specific statistic on that, but it seems like well accepted that that is what's happening. I definitely think there's a correlation here. I think that a lot of men writing fantasy get pushed up to adult, even if maybe they could belong in YA, and a lot of women writing adult fantasy get pushed down into YA. This is most likely just a marketing thing, but it is a strong mover in the market. So I want to offer my theory that perhaps a lot of this adult-ification of YA is coming from publishers and thus marketers, realizing and utilizing this phenomenon to particularly sell to women who are still reading young adult fiction. I want to be clear that everything I just said was very anecdotal and not stats-based, but I think it probably rings true for a lot of people. Another article I read suggested that this might be a natural conclusion to the young adult boom, which was considered to be the early 2000s, particularly linked to Harry Potter and the Hunger Games. And it said that those people who were teens in the early 2000s are now in their 30s and 40s and perhaps are still reading that genre because they were a part of the boom when it happened. Now, there's a variety of reasons an adult might still read young adult fiction. Those stories and situations might just capture their interest the most. Women want to read stories written by women, centering women, and those might be easier to find in young adult fiction. Maybe you're getting back into reading and you're reading the stories that you loved most when you were reading more as a kid. I want to be careful and not pass like an over judgment on this, but at the same time, we do need to talk about how that may also be affecting literacy. It's commonly cited when we talk about US literacy that a majority of adults read under a 6th grade level, or sometimes it's stated that the majority of adults read at an 8th grade level. This doesn't seem, what should I say, statistically viable. It seems based on my research that this is maybe just a way to make the stats I showed earlier more digestible. Instead of talking to people about levels of literacy, they just slap a grade on it. Okay, it's not very scientific, but let's go with it, okay? You know, most adults are reading between a 6th and an 8th grade level. That's probably an issue we should fix. But I do find if we take that interpretation broadly, a lot of people are pointing to this more adults reading YA as perhaps like proof of that, or maybe it's just a symptom of that. And like, that might be true. If we simplify this and put it in different terms, let's imagine an adult who never moved on from reading picture books. They've only ever read picture books their whole lives. Yeah, I think we could recognize that they'd probably have difficulty analyzing longer texts. They probably wouldn't have had a lot of experience with more difficult forms of critical thinking in their reading, and they probably would suffer some literacy setbacks because of it. However, we would also recognize that that was not an indictment or a moral judgment on the quality of picture books or children's literature. We would all still agree that there are fantastic picture books and fantastic children's literature that affect people of all ages. But we would recognize that it was probably limiting this person. Couldn't we just make that same statement about young adult fiction? Yes, there are incredible quality, moving pieces of art in YA that are beneficial for everyone, but maybe we could also recognize that if we get stuck in a rut of the same level of reading, it might be hard for us to grow. That said, I'm not entirely sure if adults reading YA are really the biggest portion of the literary crisis. Like, it could more just be like, A, the people who aren't reading at all, or B, the way that we are interacting with the stuff we read. I'd say it's probably more damaging to our literacy the way that we've gamified reading and the way that people sometimes online will encourage you to literally read as much as physically possible, to like post your end thing about how many books you read and race through these books, and maybe forces you to choose less difficult books and shorter books in order to reach an arbitrary goal. And perhaps you're not taking as much time to sit and consider those books, deeply engage with them, read books that are a little bit more difficult and might take you longer to read. I want to make sure I bring some of these points together clearly and concisely. While I do think it's important for literacy and learning that readers stretch themselves and engage with more difficult works, I think the large focus on those who are already reading may not be our biggest battle. I suspect the increasing number of individuals who aren't reading at all, the rising overconsumption of media in terms of doom scrolling that competes for our time, and the reliance of teens on ChatGPT for literacy goals that they need to develop themselves before outsourcing, like summarizing, for example, are big fish to fry, if not the primary ones, in our literary crisis. We could dive deeper into the nuance of all those points, but I'm just using those as a quick example. Literacy is a complex issue, and I think there are a lot of things at play, and that adults reading YA probably isn't the first on our list. Whenever I've tried to broach this topic in my other videos, I inevitably get comments that say I come off as condescending and I am telling people not to read things that they enjoy. I hope in the 40 odd minutes I've forced you to listen to this that I'm trying to approach this topic with nuance, and I'm not trying to say you shouldn't read the things you enjoy. I don't think it always has to be black and white. I think we need to be allowed to have these conversations though, if we are actually worried about literacy rates in the US. So I don't think it's about taking away what you love, but I do think it's about maybe taking stock of your life in return in terms of some questions like, is there something in my life that is exercising my brain? Is there something in my life that is exercising my literacy? Is there something in my life that is exercising my critical thinking skills? And honestly, I think this comes right back to our literacy conversation for teens as well. I had a friend who had a very reluctant reader, and as many reluctant readers are recommended to do, is to get into graphic novels. And this child ended up loving graphic novels, and it was doing great. But later, her teacher commented that her child began struggling in their narrative writing because this child was not being able to write any descriptions of stuff that was happening and was regularly leaving out dialogue tags. Because this child was only reading graphic novels, they really only knew how to talk in dialogue, which is what a lot of graphic novels are. And it was recommended that this child start introducing prose novels as well to kind of remedy this, that they had a more wider experience with different kinds of books. I love this example because it's so clearly not saying that graphic novels are somehow lesser. We're not trying to ignore the really important history and artistic value of graphic novels and comic books and the like, which have had a long history in literature and are really important. But what it is saying is that reading widely and a lot of different things is what's going to make you well-rounded and contribute to your literacy. I think this kind of clickbaity YA today is trash and the adultification of YA is trash and adult women reading YA are just, it's embarrassing and garbage, is just kind of like an immature take on it. I think we need to incorporate the moderation eating kind of style where instead of focusing on taking away, we need to just focus on adding good things. I'm not about to stop reading my fun novels, guys, and I'm not about to tell you to stop reading the stuff that's making you happy. But I'm saying you can also add other things or good things on top of it. You can add some things that stretch you a little more in conjunction with the stuff you already love, if you're worried that that is a problem for you. But yes, coming around full circle, I just think one of the bigger aspects of adults reading YA can be a problem only because it's potentially taking away a very important classifications of works that our teens need in order to achieve their literacy goals. But that's just a possibility. I don't think any of these things are cut and dry. The last thing I want to briefly touch on is the classification of new adult, which is something that I've seen recently gaining steam. I'll be honest, when I first heard of new adult, I scoffed at it. I just felt like, why do we overclassify everything? Why does everything have to be in a smaller and smaller bucket? But weirdly, while researching and forming this video, it kind of shifted my mind on this and made me think, hey, new adult could actually be a really great classification, with the idea of if it actually helps us separate out this kind of YA style fiction that's really aimed at adults versus kind of more true YA fiction that's aimed at that much younger teen audience. The thing about the new adult, though, for it to be useful is it would have to actually be used as a classification, which I feel like right now it absolutely isn't. These things take time. You know, we saw earlier with YA in general, it took decades. So it becomes useful if we actually, use it, because I do feel like kind of now it's just in this no man's land where like sometimes it's used and sometimes it's not, so it's not really beneficial. I don't have a lot to say about that. I just wanted to throw out that I'm aware of that category, and I think if it solved this problem, it could potentially be beneficial. Okay, we've explored a lot here. Let's talk about some final consensus. What have we maybe learned? There is some evidence that YA is changing and becoming older with more adult themes. There's also evidence that the age of readers for YA is also getting older. This matters because teens need literature that speak to their experiences, that they enjoy, and is appropriately challenging for them in order to grow their literacy. Quality and good literature isn't as cut and dry as what we may typically think of as quality. Literature that speaks to experiences is also a vital component. More adults are reading YA for probably a variety of reasons. This is potentially why YA has become more adult overall. Some say the literacy crisis is because of this, or others say that it's just a symptom of it. While there is probably some truth to that in both cases, I personally think it's more complicated. We need to remove our quality stigma from these stories as we recognize that stories for all ages, from the youngest picture books to the more adult YA, can be meaningful and impactful. I think that women authors are often being pushed into YA is another reason the adultification of YA has happened, from both angles. I think it would be beneficial if we just started calling these stories adult. This would probably require a massive shift in marketing and in buying behavior, which is why it's going to be difficult. Ultimately, this classification was created as a tool for parents and educators to get the right books into kids' hands. And it is a little frustrating that this shift, I think, is making that more difficult. But I feel like since so much of our book trends are dictated by buyers markets and marketing and publishers, this may be a difficult shift to course correct. I don't think we necessarily need to be overly worried about the adultification of YA or use kind of scare tactics, but I do think it can be frustrating when the original intended purpose of a classification is no longer able to be used in that way. And I think it will kind of harm that part of us in the future, but not that these books shouldn't exist or that they're bad for existing. Also, learning is important, guys, and continuing to learn even when you're out of school is important. So I'm always advocating finding ways to grow and learn. If you're still here, congratulations. Thank you so much for going on this journey with me. I would love to know your opinions on the adultification of YA. If you think I'm way off base and we should be way more worried, if there's something I didn't think about or didn't address, please let me know in the comments. I love to keep the discussion going. And as always, if you like these kind of deep dives and discussions, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.